Hello and welcome to the Alastair Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. Today I'm delighted to be talking to a negotiator, mediator and trainer with specialisms in employment law. He works for a national healthcare union and a charity delivering disability awareness training into workplaces. He's also a trustee for a national charity supporting children with upper limb difference, which is in fact where we actually first met. So welcome, Steve Haynes.
Thanks, Alastair. Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a real pleasure. And you know what I really love is this whole podcast series is I've been able to speak to so many people from such a wide variety of backgrounds. And, you know, your skills in negotiation is something that I think probably most people feel they're doing every single day of their lives, but probably not as well as you. Well, I'm sure not as well as you. So I'm really looking forward to some really helpful tips that you're going to be able to help us all with to bridge those generation gaps.
The dark arts of negotiation, you mean, Alastair?
Okay. Yes, exactly. But let's start off by talking a little bit about you and your background. We met this great charity called Reach, which supports children and their families with upper limb differences. So let's talk about you as a millennial growing up, going to a charity like Reach and that support network that you got. Because I think you mentioned just before we went on air that possibly led the trajectory that you ended up following.
Yeah, I think, I don't think it can be understated, really, the impact that having an upper limb difference can have on the formation of someone's identity. And not only the kind of disabling aspect of it, but also the visible difference side of it. And I always talk, I'm a trustee for Reach, and I always talk about the superpowers that Reach children have. They tend to be incredibly creative because they have to think round problems from day one. They tend to be very good at reading a room. You get very used to power dynamics within a room and threat perception because you're worried about, am I going to get bullied from that child at school? And then you're incredibly tenacious as well. My partner would say stubborn, but I think those three superpowers really kind of play into the role that I now do. Yeah.
And certainly those skills, as you said, that you acquired through being a Reach child, as we call them. I've been involved with the charity for many years, and I think it does such a fabulous job. And when we get together at those various events to see those children together sharing stories, and in many senses that almost reflects what you do in your negotiation work in terms of that you're sharing experiences and stories to actually help the better good of everybody.
Yeah, that's right. And you, as a negotiator, why don't we delve straight into negotiation? Because I think we're going to end up referring back to it. And the way I kind of think about negotiation really is it's almost like a series of steps that I would think about, right? So usually in the first instance, you need to find out what your BATNA is, what I would call BATNA. It's from a negotiation book that was published many years ago. And it's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So what lies outside of this negotiation? What other options do I have that are an alternative to us agreeing what we're trying to agree? And that's what effectively gives you the guide as to how much power you've got in that negotiation. If you've got lots of options outside of this negotiation, you carry more power than if you've got fewer options. And for me, that then decides the strategy of the negotiation. So if you've got power in the negotiation, you might go for what I would call a push style, where you're pushing your position onto the other side. If your power isn't strong, then I would rely on what I would call a pull negotiation. So you're trying to draw the other side to your argument. And you can do that through collaboration, empathy, trying to draw out empathy. And I tend to use a lot of if-thens in that situation. So, for example, I'd say, if you can do this, then we can do that. And you're encouraging that kind of collaboration. And really what you're looking for is what I would call value trade. So something that's of high value to the other side, that's of low value to our side, and vice versa. Because what you're trying to do is find the overlap in the middle of the Venn diagram. You've got two different agendas. and you're trying to find, is there anything in the middle that we can reach agreement on that it's for mutual benefit? And then from there, I sometimes might throw in a few little tactical. I did refer to the dark arts of negotiation earlier, and something to give you a little indication as to that is what I would call my car mats principle, which is just as you're about to shake hands with the car dealer, you ask for the mats. So it's not enough to derail the whole negotiation, but you get something extra that's they probably wouldn't have agreed if you'd have mentioned it earlier on. So yeah, they're some of the things that I might use, and it's a very different negotiation style. I mean, I do talk about car dealership a lot. I do sound like a second-hand car dealer, but I'm not, I promise you. But just going back to car dealership for a moment, if you were buying a new car from a car dealer and it was going to be a one-off transaction, yeah, you'd probably try and get the best deal that you could. If that's going to be you're going to be buying a new car every 2 years from the same dealer, that's a very different negotiation style. It's about building the trust, the relationship, and because over the long run, then you're more likely to get more out of that negotiation. So I think all of those kind of strategies really play into what I was talking about earlier in terms of understanding power dynamics, being able to read body language, which come from having an upper limb difference, I think, in my mind. I also kind of grew up in a family which is not scared of confrontation in terms of challenging each other and locking horns over things. I always think of it as the Socratic method of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So somebody puts forward an argument, somebody puts forward a counter argument, and then it probably lies somewhere in between the right answer. And I'm certainly from a family that embarks in conversation in that guise. So I'm not scared of conflict. I'm not worried about being in kind of hostile, unpleasant situations and trying to resolve conflict in that way. And I can talk a little bit. I'm also a trained mediator, and actually that's a very different skill, but born out of the same upbringing, if you like.
And also you can then add in the generational aspect to that, because obviously you were born in an era, as a millennial, you were born in an era where actually it was perceived that it was all about collaboration. You know, they say that, certainly from everything I've read, that millennials are great collaborators. It's just the nature of their growing up. When they were at school, it was the first generation to really have much of a voice at school, and they therefore, by virtue of all of that, became great communicators and great collaborators. Would you say that was typical of your upbringing?
Well, I think of it as I feel that I was quite lucky, really, because I kind of bridged mobile phone, not having a phone, to having a phone. So I think for generations after me, it's probably a little bit more difficult, because I never had the option growing up that if I was in a confrontational situation, I could escape into a device and be somewhere else. And I think that's a big difference, because I learned those skills to resolve conflict, to mediate, to negotiate, before I had the option of being able to, like I say, escape into a device where, even though I'm physically present in a room, emotionally and psychologically, I'm somewhere else.
Yeah, being present is such a massive talking point today, isn't it? You know, whether people are really focused, and that we could go down a rabbit hole very easily talking about that. But again, coming to your upbringing, because I'm always a huge fan of the concept that your upbringing really does shape what happens to you later on in life. And, you know, then you add in the era. And as you say, you were at, you know, being an older millennial, you were somebody who was very much having to confront issues as they came along, because there was nowhere else to go. But were you given a voice as a youngster? Did you feel that maybe compared to the upbringing that your parents had, that you were involved in conversations more?
Maybe, but I mean, my dad is 85 this year, and he was a very senior police officer, and he was often throughout his career called a rebel without a cause. I don't think he was scared of speaking up, and actually he ended up in working in discipline and complaints for the police, because he is very much not prone to what I would call groupthink, and treating situations as an individual rather than getting drawn into assumption and bias in that way. So I think it comes from there. I think also being different, visibly different, means I'm already kind of halfway to being a challenger, a contrarian, because I've already accepted that difference. And so that's something that I've never really struggled with. I really try and avoid groupthink. And actually, we can come on to talk about how bias in negotiation it can be a downfall. But yeah, I don't. It's funny, when I was thinking about what we might talk about today, I kind of worried a bit, really, because I thought, well, I genuinely don't see generational. I don't see it in the stereotype way. Like if you were to say to me Gen X, I genuinely would have to look up what ages that related to. I don't think of it in that way. And that's probably as a result of trying not to fall into assumptions from my job. But I think also something that I didn't mention is that I was a professional musician for 10 years working in the West End. And I grew up in the brass band tradition in Yorkshire, where it's the law, isn't it? Fish and chips on a Friday and brass band on Saturday. And I was given a trombone at school because it was the only instrument that I could play with my limb difference. It didn't require any adaptation for valves or anything like that. So, I grew up playing the trombone and immediately went into brass bands from being 8, 9 years old, and was sitting next to people in their 60s. And so... yeah, I'd always, as I was growing up, if I was on principal trombone in a band, more often than not, my second trombone player was double my age. And so I don't think I've ever really thought in those terms. And actually, when I went away and thought about why that was, when I was thinking about what we might talk about today, I thought, well, actually, if you've got a shared purpose, be that music or sport, whatever it is, then actually those barriers or those perceptions of barriers just fall away.
And I've seen this time and time again in conversations I've had, guests on my podcasts and the research for my book. And that's come up time and time again, that people who have been surrounded by multiple generations growing up, where that was normalized and difference of generation wasn't highlighted in any way, shape or form, that actually their viewpoints are very different to people who've had a slightly more siloed approach, if you like, to the way that they were brought up, and they've only ever spent time with people of their own generation. And you're absolutely right. People who have spent time with lots of different generations, one of the reasons I still work in schools is because I want to feel that I understand where they are and what's going on, because then to me it becomes normal and I get it. And that in your work must be a huge help. And we were saying just before we started recording this podcast about that generational bias is something that you deliberately avoid in negotiation.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you don't want any bias, because as soon as you start assuming what someone might want, you've stopped trying to understand their perspective. You know, I always think about that phrase: "Listen to understand, don't listen to respond," and that's really what I try and do. And especially in a negotiation, when it comes to, I mean, there's a reason that age is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, because it leads people to have biases about, perceptions they might have about a certain generation. And absolutely, as a negotiator, you don't want that. You want to see each situation on the merits that's in front of you, rather than any perceived bias going into that situation. So, sometimes if I hear of people trying to research the other side of a negotiation team, I think, well, you've already formed an opinion. You're not going to be listening in the negotiation and in that moment to what the other side wants, because you've already formed an opinion of what they might want.
So how do you think people generally in life can deal with generational bias? And let's be honest, like all unconscious biases, it's natural by definition. It's not something we can avoid, but we have to step out of our comfort zone and recognize that we're doing it and therefore deal with that. What are the kind of steps that you think people can do to reduce that level of unconscious bias by making specific moves in a certain direction?
I think, well, the first thing is exactly what you've just said, is recognizing that you might have an unconscious bias. I remember attending an employment tribunal once, and the judge said something along the lines of, if you think that you've not got subconscious biases, then you've not addressed whether you've got subconscious biases, because we all have them, and it's about knowing those. And I spoke earlier about a different set of skills in mediation, for example. And one of my biases is I always want to fight for the underdog in any situation. If I perceive a power imbalance, I want to try and redress that on behalf of the party that is suffering as a consequence of that. And actually, in a mediation, that's not appropriate, because it's their agreement, not mine. So I have to remove that, and I have to try and ride that wave of seeing a power imbalance and people going at each other, someone perhaps quite vulnerable being, in my mind, attacked. But it's the emotion that needs to come out in that situation that then leads them to find the common ground and move on. And as I always say, look, you don't have to be friends; you just have to be able to work together. So yeah, I think the first point really is exactly what you said: is just recognizing that you might have some kind of biases, whether they're related to any of the protected characteristics or characteristics that aren't protected under the Equality Act. I think it's just about having that awareness, that self-awareness. And as someone with a limb difference, I think that naturally leads me to be quite reflective and look inwards, and so I've had to do that myself.
When you see people exhibiting unconscious generational bias, which you must in negotiations and mediations that you've been involved in, how do you steer people away from it to get actually back to the main point?
Focusing on the goal. It's the music and sport thing again, and I'm very conscious of those barriers, those walls kind of getting in the way of the shared outcome. So I'll always try and move people back to the common goal and what we're trying to achieve. I very much use the kind of objective strategy tactics, and often in any situation, in a leadership role, whatever it is, you can get so embroiled in the tactics and the strategy that you forget what the objective is. And so I'll try and take people back to the objective, and say, look, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? And then you re-find that common ground, because if people start getting drawn into an us and them, you're not sitting around the same. The best negotiations are when you sit on the same side of the table eventually, and it stops becoming an us and them. And really, you can start out very much with sitting opposite each other, but again, it's just trying to find that overlap in the middle of the Venn diagram. And it might be possible. It might be. It's perfectly acceptable to say we might not reach agreement on this. Don't forget the BATNA again. You can walk away and you can go, well, actually, I don't think we are going to agree on this, and that's not a failure. Sometimes there isn't any overlap in that Venn diagram.
One of the things we do know is that, forget the generational biases, but different generations do communicate in different ways. They present themselves in different ways. If you just look at maybe the level of formality in a conversation, for example, will be quite different. So you might be having to bridge that gap where it's not necessarily the generational bias that's exhibiting itself, but actually just the nature of the way that people present because of their age difference. How do you kind of negotiate that path?
That's interesting. Yeah, I genuinely don't really think about it too much. I think I would just try and use kind of charm and persuasion really to try and bring people back to where I wanted them to be. And humour is really effective in a negotiation. But sometimes what I try and avoid is serving aces on my own tennis court and not understanding why the ball's not coming back. And sometimes you have to go on to the other tennis court. You have to go onto their tennis court to play them at tennis, right? So, yeah, sometimes you can go, okay, well, that is obviously a problem for them, and you can kind of show some level of conformity and wanting to do things right. You can even give off the illusion of something, or you can even give a very small thing which will make a big difference to the other side. So, for example, if someone turns up to a negotiation and they're dressed very formally, and I've turned up in a Ratings t-shirt like I've got on now, great band, by the way, little plug there, great band from Rotherham, the Ratings. And someone's dressed very formally, and there's some comment made about, oh, you're obviously not taking this negotiation seriously, the way that you've dressed, say. Then I have a choice there. I can either dig my heels in, or I can turn up wearing smart attire next time. And actually, it doesn't make any difference to me. And if that means that they feel like they've won, and then I can shoehorn a load of stuff in as a Trojan horse, then it's an effective negotiation. So, yeah, I think sometimes it's about going onto the other tennis court and playing them at their game.
I love that, because we can't help it. We're still animals at heart. We make a judgment of someone. All of those unconscious biases come out, and we judge people by our own standards. And that's not saying they're high, low, or anything. They're just different to maybe the other person. And we all know that, especially language, is such a key part of any form of relationship, and certainly a key part of negotiations and mediations. How do you get the language to be equally understandable to both parties, so that one side aren't overcomplicated using words and using terminology that the other side might not understand? How do you bridge that gap?
Well, I think it's about figuring out why they're using that language. Are they using it to intimidate? And if they are, then you just say, well, what do you mean? And you just keep drilling down until you get to the fundamentals of what they're trying to communicate. Language is super important, because it can be a weapon. You can use words, very emotive words, that bring out a reaction in the other side. And sometimes you might want to do that. But then likewise, you can use language that's not emotional, that's not inflammatory. You can focus on facts and objectivity. And try and use that as a bridge to bring people across to your side. So yeah, I think language is hugely important, and how you use it. And I always try to be careful with the words that I'm using to make sure they're appropriate, and the tone as well. You can emphasize a word in a certain way that can bring out a reaction in someone, just from the word that you've emphasized in the sentence. I use the example of, I think you're a good presenter. And, I think you're a good presenter. I think you're a good presenter. That's a very different meaning. It's the same word. So, it's sometimes about how you deliver it. And again, it goes back to the tennis court thing. How is it landing with the other side? Is it why is that bringing out a reaction in the other side? And again, you have to reflect and think, am I delivering this in a way that's, and sometimes you, like I say, you want to bring out that reaction. Sometimes you have to break a situation to then bring it back together again, to change the power dynamic in the room and get more of what you want.
I'm going to ask you something that you probably won't want to do, but give it your best shot. Is that we know that the way that we see each other is different. We know that older generations see younger generations as a massive stereotype. But what tips would you have with someone who may be a younger generation, say a Gen Z, so under 30, who is now negotiating with someone who's much older, who they may feel intimidated by? They may feel that they don't have the upper hand because they're in the position they have, or maybe actually they feel overly strong because they've got way too much confidence that possibly they should have in at their age and level of experience. So that dynamic with an older person, we'll take it from the perspective of the young first. Have you got any tips of how they can connect with an older generation better, and therefore hopefully get some form of more positive result?
Well, again, I think it starts with self-reflection. And it's interesting you talk about the two different ways that effectively you're talking about self-worth, really, and self-esteem, and the two different ways that they might manifest themselves. So it might be that someone feels vulnerable, and they don't approach it in a very, stern way, or they don't feel able to speak up in the way that they would want to. And I always think that sometimes the bigger the front, the bigger the back. Sometimes someone who presents as really outgoing and flamboyant, actually there's a lot going on behind the scenes there that screams vulnerability. So, and I kind of feel for the younger generations, really, because if you're if you're basing your self-worth on what others think about you, that's out of your control. And actually, if you then if you extrapolate that and put that through the magnifier of social media, for example, you're basing your self-worth now on what people that you've never met think about you. And statistics seem to say that for every 5 people you meet, one of them isn't going to like you, whatever you do. So if you're basing your self-esteem on that, then you're going to struggle, I think. So my advice to someone in that position would be try and bring your self-worth back to things that you can control, things that make you happy, the work that you've put in. Sometimes you can't control what the other person's going to do, but as long as you've put in the work and done everything that you could, and you've tried your best, you can't do any better than your best.
That's great advice. What about the other way round, when you've got somebody who, maybe one of the people we were talking about earlier on, who just don't get the young, they see them as aliens almost, and, they've got to come to the negotiating table. What kind of things can they do to try and reduce their own unconscious bias and also then connect better with that younger person?
I think base your opinions on things that you've read, not things that you've heard, is a good starting point for any situation. I was just thinking when you said that, Alastair, about a French horn player in the music business. He said, "I didn't get to where I was yesterday by playing like I do today," and that always that always stuck with me. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. It's very easy to when you're a freelance musician, you're only as good as your last gig. And that stays with you throughout your career, and there's nothing sadder than someone who, because it's such a physical thing, there's nothing kind of sadder than someone holding a really high reputation and perhaps still thinking themselves that they hold that high reputation when the reality is that they're perhaps not. So I think it's the same advice, really. It's about basing your self-worth on the moment and things that you can control, and it's not a dissimilar position really to the other side of that conundrum that you presented me with. It's about being keenly in the moment and being honest with yourself.
Brilliant. Yeah, I really love that, and I think what you were talking there about, accepting where you are at that moment and where the other person is at that moment is crucial.
Which goes back, Alistair, sorry to say, it goes back exactly to what we were talking about a few moments ago, is assumptions. Yeah. If you're saying to me that someone's gone into that negotiation, a younger person's gone in with the assumption that they're not going to be able to speak up, and an older person's gone into it thinking that they've seen it all before and who's this young person coming in. Both of those people have formed assumptions about that situation before they've gone into it.
Yeah, and we all know the phrase about assumptions and what it does to people. And one of the things, the purpose of this podcast and the purpose of most of my work is all about breaking down those assumptions. Yeah. Yes, there are certain patterns which are really helpful, but actually they only go so far.
I mean, to me, sorry to jump in again, Alastair, to me, assumptions are just shortcuts to misunderstanding, aren't they?
Perfect. I'm going to keep that one. I'm going to nick that if you don't mind. I think that's perfect. Assumptions are shortcuts for misunderstandings, and you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things we want to try and avoid. Just to finish off, Steve, I mean, it's been gold dust, the stuff that you've been sharing with us, really helpful. And they're things that people can apply to their everyday lives, whether that's socially, amongst the family, or indeed at work. Just to finish off, for somebody who is negotiating something really small perhaps, or maybe going into a massive negotiation, what are kind of the golden rules, if you like, that someone should be thinking about before going into that negotiation?
I think thinking about what it is that you're trying to achieve and whether that's realistic or not. And it might be, for example, that it could be realistic for someone who feels more confident going into that negotiation. But if you're not an expert negotiator with a background in employment law, and you're trying to go into a negotiation with your employer, then they're going to run rings around you. So I would say, be realistic about what you think you can achieve, based on your BATNA and your skill set.
Great advice, and I shall bear that in mind next time I negotiate my fee for my next job.
Well, if you want a negotiator
Steve,
to help you with that, Alastair, you know where I am.
Absolutely. Now, really interesting. Normally, Steve, we put people's socials in the show notes and things, and you deliberately don't have any socials.
Yeah, just going back to really the self-worth thing, you know, I don't like the idea of basing my kind of self-worth on what other people think about me. I mean, that's not the reason I came off social media in the first place. It was more to do with the algorithms portraying things to me, or honing what I was seeing that bothered me. And I realised that quite a long time ago, given my background. I used to get into some very fruity arguments on social media with people who thought very differently to me. And all of a sudden, I start being shown posts from people who thought the same way as me. And I didn't quite get the same fun from that, and realised that actually the algorithms were creating this echo chamber of what I should think. And again, that just entrenches people's beliefs. So yeah, I steer clear of it.
So if you want to get hold of Steve, you'll have to get hold of me first, and then we'll decide whether to to connect you. And then the other thing, of course, is what we could do is we could put in the charity that we both feel very strongly about, Reach, for the charity for children and their families with upper limb differences. So maybe we'll pop that in the show notes instead.
Yeah, fine by me, Alastair, yeah.
Steve, thank you so much. I've really appreciated all of your valuable advice and wise words. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem, Alastair. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And thank you for watching or listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. See you then. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.